The cold wind swept across Fort Ridge Military Base, carrying with it the scent of metal, dust, and routine, a routine that usually made the early morning hours feel slow and predictable. The sun had barely risen, and its faint golden light reflected off the tall steel fences that surrounded the base like an impenetrable shield. Guards stood at their designated posts, bundled in thick jackets, their hands tucked into pockets for warmth. It was just another quiet day, or so everyone believed.
We honor the
At the main
traditions
checkpoint,
and
two young
service
guards,
of our
Private Miller
predecessors.
and Private Jackson, leaned lazily against the small booth. Both were fresh recruits, only a few months into service. The air of overconfidence clung to them, the kind that often came with youth and limited experience. They joked around to pass the time, complaining about the cold, their schedules, and the monotony of checking IDs all morning. "Bet today's gonna be another snoozefest," Jackson said, glancing down the empty road stretching toward the gate. "Hope so." Miller replied with a smirk. "Last thing we need is some old vet telling us stories from the Stone Age again." They both laughed, unaware that life was about to hand them a moment they would never forget. Then they saw a figure approaching slowly from the distance, a man, old, hunched, walking with a cane that tapped against the concrete at a steady rhythm. He wore a thick, worn-out coat that looked older than the guards themselves. His boots were coated with dust, and the wind tugged at his gray hair, blowing it across his weathered face. But even from afar, it was clear that there was something different about him. Something in the way he held himself despite the frailty of age. "Looks like you summoned an old vet with your jokes," Jackson muttered, nudging Miller with an elbow. Miller chuckled, but as the man neared, the amusement in his eyes sharpened into curiosity. The old man's presence felt oddly heavy, as if he carried not just age but stories, real ones, buried deep beneath those quiet eyes. When he finally reached the gate, he paused to catch his breath. Jackson stepped forward, his tone half playful, half dismissive. "Sir, ID please." The old man nodded and reached into his coat pocket. His hand trembled slightly, not with fear but simply age. He pulled out a faded military identification card and handed it over without a word. Miller took the ID and stared at it, eyebrows rising. The card was worn to the point of nearly falling apart. The corners were frayed, the print half faded, and the lamination peeling. To the two young guards, it looked more like a relic than an official document. "You sure this is an ID and not something from a museum?" Miller said loudly, allowing his laughter to echo down the gate tunnel. Jackson snorted. "Sir, with respect, kind of. We can't accept this. It's practically fossilized." The old man didn't respond to the mockery. Instead, he stood silently, his breathing calm but his eyes sharp, like someone used to patience far deeper than theirs. "I need to enter," he said in a low, steady voice. "It is urgent." His tone wasn't angry, it wasn't pleading, it was firm, controlled. The kind of voice people listen to instinctively even if they don't understand why. But Miller and Jackson were too focused on their amusement. "Sir, unless you're secretly Captain America, we can't let anyone in with an ID like this." Jackson joked. This time, the old man looked directly into Jackson's eyes. Something in that gaze made the young guard shift uncomfortably, though he couldn't say why. Those eyes weren't just old. They carried weight, experience, and something else he couldn't put into words. "Call your senior officer." The old man said, "Sir, we don't have time. This matter concerns national security." The sentence hung in the air like frost, crisp and chilling. Both guards hesitated. Miller frowned, confusion creeping into his face. National security with that old card. Before either of them could decide whether to laugh or take him seriously, the old man slowly lifted his hand to his chest. On his coat was a tiny silver pin, almost invisible unless someone looked closely. He pressed it gently. A small light blinked once, just once, but that was enough. A sharp beep sounded from Miller's wrist device. He looked down, expecting a weather alert or base announcement. His jaw dropped instead. A red message flashed. *** level 3, ID detected, classified access. Stand by for command. *** Jackson leaned over his shoulder. No way, that's real. But the device didn't stop flashing. The old man remained still, offering no explanation, no reaction. He simply waited. Before the guards could gather themselves, the distant rumble of engines filled the air. military trucks approached the gate from inside the base. Soldiers jumped out and formed a perimeter as if responding to a high-level threat or a protected arrival. The young guards froze. Miller swallowed hard. What is happening? Jackson whispered. Who asterisk is asterisk this guy? Their earlier laughter had vanished, replaced by the sudden realization that they had mocked someone far beyond their understanding. And then, from one of the vehicles, stepped a figure neither guard expected to see. Someone they had only seen during briefings or displayed in hallways. Their commanding general, and he wasn't looking at them. He was walking straight toward the old man, as if greeting an equal. The guards stood in stunned silence, unaware that the quiet stranger they had teased minutes earlier was about to change everything they thought they knew about respect, duty, and the hidden strength behind the simplest acts of kindness. The moment the old man pressed the silver pin on his coat, the entire atmosphere around the checkpoint shifted. It was as if time itself paused for a heartbeat. The guards felt a strange tension prick the air, subtle but undeniable. Miller looked at the blinking device on his wrist, his face tightening with confusion. "What did you just do?" he asked, but his voice suddenly lacked the confidence it had carried earlier. The old man didn't answer. He simply stood there, calm and composed, as if he had expected this reaction all along. His silence made the two young guards even more uneasy. Jackson stepped forward, trying to regain control of the situation. "Sir, pressing a button doesn't magically make you someone important. We still need a proper ID." But the words felt shallow even to him. Before the old man could reply, Miller's wrist device vibrated again, this time louder, more urgent. He lifted it with trembling hands. His eyes widened as a new message appeared across the screen in bold red letters. Asterisk asterisk, restricted identity code activated, initiating top secret protocol. Asterisk asterisk. For a moment, neither guard breathed. Jackson leaned closer. Is this real? But the device wasn't finished. A third message followed. Asterisk asterisk, all gate personnel, hold position. Security command en route. Asterisk asterisk, Jackson took a step back from the old man as if he might suddenly explode or shift into something unimaginable. Panic flickered across his face, replacing the earlier mockery. "Sir, who exactly are you?" he stuttered. The old man looked at him, not with anger, but with patience. "Someone who warned you that this matter is important." Jackson and Miller exchanged looks. They tried to hide their fear, but their hands were already shaking. Just minutes ago, they were laughing, teasing the frail veteran with jokes about Captain America and fossilized IDs. Now they felt like characters in a thriller who had accidentally triggered a classified chain of events. The silence was broken only by the distant rumble of approaching engines and the soft tapping of the old man's cane on the concrete as he shifted his weight. Jackson suddenly felt a knot form in his throat. He cleared it, trying once again to assert authority. "Sir, why didn't you just say your ID was special? Why didn't you tell us who you are?" The old man gave a faint, almost sad smile. "You judge the card before judging the person." The sentence was simple, but it struck deep. Miller swallowed hard. It was the kind of statement that hits a soldier in his conscience, especially a young one still trying to understand what respect truly means. But the moment of reflection didn't last long. The approaching sound of tires screeching on asphalt snapped their attention back to the gate. A convoy of military vehicles stopped abruptly just inside the perimeter. Doors flew open. Soldiers in higher, ranking uniforms poured out, and the tension in the air thickened like smoke. Miller stepped back instinctively, unsure whether he should greet them, salute them, or hide behind the guard booth. "What did we do?" he whispered. Jackson didn't answer. His breathing had turned shallow. Suddenly, a tall figure emerged from the main vehicle, dressed in immaculate uniform, shoulders rigid, and face carved from years of command. He walked briskly toward the gate. Even from a distance, his presence was intimidating. "Is that General Hawthorne?" Miller muttered, hardly believing his eyes. It couldn't be. The general was known for strict discipline and rarely left the command center unless something extraordinarily serious happened. Yet here he was. Neither guard knew whether to brace themselves for punishment or prepare for some kind of emergency drill. General Hawthorne did not even glance at the two young guards as he approached. He marched past them as if they were invisible. His eyes were locked on the old man. Focused, sharp, and almost relieved, Jackson blinked rapidly. Why is he going to him? The general stopped in front of the old man and stood at attention. Then, in a move that stunned every guard present, he lifted his hand in a crisp, respectful salute. "Sir," the general said with a tone Miller had never heard him use. "Not once. We received your signal. The base has been on stand by for your arrival." The old man nodded slightly. It was necessary. Miller felt the world tilt. Jackson looked like he might faint. This wasn't just an elderly veteran. This was someone the general saluted. The realization hit the guards like a tidal wave of regret. Their earlier mockery suddenly sounded cruel and reckless in their minds. The jokes they had made now felt like insults carved into stone, impossible to erase. Miller's throat tightened as he realized how badly they had misjudged the man. But instead of anger, the old man's gaze softened when he looked at them again. There was no spite in his eyes, only a quiet understanding. "Don't worry," he said gently, almost reading their thoughts. In this world, appearances often mislead those who haven't learned to look deeper. His words echoed heavily in their ears. They were simple, but they carried more wisdom than all the training sessions the young soldiers had been through. General Hawthorne finally turned to the guards, and both snapped to attention instantly, hoping their trembling knees weren't obvious. "Privates," the general said, his voice stern but strangely neutral, "you will receive an explanation soon. For now, know this, the man you stopped is classified far above your clearance. His identification may look old, but his influence is not." Jackson blinked, unable to process the magnitude of the situation. Miller felt his stomach drop. "Sir, we didn't know." The general gave them a hard stare. "That is precisely why respect should never depend on what you think you know." Neither guard dared to speak after that. They watched silently as the general escorted the old man through the gate, an action that said more than any reprimand ever could. And as the convoy followed behind, the young soldiers felt something far heavier than fear settle on their shoulders. A lesson, one they would never forget. General Hawthorne's boots struck the concrete with steady, forceful steps as he walked toward the old man. The soldiers who had poured out of the vehicles formed a semicircle behind him, their expressions a mixture of confusion and strict discipline. To them, this was clearly no ordinary visitor. Orders had been urgent, coded, and given with the kind of urgency usually reserved for national emergencies. But to Miller and Jackson, the scene unfolding before them felt surreal, like watching a movie in which they had somehow stumbled into the wrong role. Just minutes earlier, they had been cracking jokes. Now, the highest-ranking officer on the base was saluting the very man they had mocked. General Hawthorne stopped just a foot away from the old man, his usually stone, hard expression softened. Not fully, but enough that even the young privates noticed. "Commander Reed," the general said, his voice carrying respect that echoed across the checkpoint. "We've been expecting your signal. Headquarters notified me immediately." Commander Reed. The title alone twisted something in Jackson's gut. He had no idea what level of authority that meant, but it was clearly far beyond anything he could comprehend. The old Mankum, Commander Reed, returned the salute with a controlled, precise motion. His hand was steady, the gesture practiced. Age had touched his skin and bones, but his discipline remained unshaken. "Hawthorne," Reed replied, "good to see you still keeping this place in one piece." The general allowed himself a tight smile. "Only because we've had people like you building the foundation." Those words hit the young guards hard. Suddenly, the war. Now ID card didn't seem like a joke anymore. It felt like a small window into a past they knew nothing about. General Hawthorne turned to Miller and Jackson, who snapped to attention so fast it might have hurt their backs. "Privates," the general began. His voice carried none of the warmth he'd shown the commander. It was cold, sharp, and authoritative, an edge that could cut through steel. "What happened here?" The two soldiers exchanged panicked glances. Their minds raced for an answer that wouldn't make them look like complete fools, but there was none. Jackson spoke first, his voice trembling slightly. "Sir, we didn't know his identity, his ID. It looked outdated, and we assumed you assumed." Hawthorne repeated, the words slicing through the air. Miller swallowed hard. "Sir, we meant no disrespect. We followed protocol, but protocol," the general interrupted, "does not include mockery." Both guards felt the blood drain from their faces. They stared at the ground, feeling smaller than they had ever felt in their lives. But then something unexpected happened. Commander Reed stepped forward, raising a hand gently. "These boys made a mistake," he said calmly, "but that's what youth does. Let's not punish eagerness when guidance will do more good." Hawthorne hesitated. His respect for Reed was clear in the way he turned slightly toward him. "Commander, with all due respect, they did their job," Reed said, "and learned something today that no classroom could have taught them." His tone wasn't defensive. It was wise, reassuring, the voice of someone who understood leadership on a deeper level, someone who had lived through decades of battles, decisions, and losses. Miller lifted his eyes slightly. He had expected anger, maybe humiliation. Instead, he found kindness, a softness that contrasted sharply with the commander's imposing history. Jackson felt something similar. The old man wasn't seeking revenge, wasn't demanding apologies. He was teaching them simply by existing. The general exhaled slowly, very well. Then, with the stiffness of authority returning, he addressed the guards once more. "You too will be briefed later. For now, remain at your posts." "Yes, sir," they replied in unison. As the general and Commander Reed walked toward the base, a line of soldiers trailing behind, the young guards watched with a mix of awe and regret. Commander Reed's steps were slow but steady, his cane tapping lightly against the smooth pavement. His presence seemed to command the air around him, not by force, but by the weight of respect earned over a lifetime. Jackson whispered, barely audible, "We mocked him." Miller nodded, his throat tight, and the general saluted him. Can you believe that he saluted him? The reality of their mistake hit them like a second wave. Their earlier laughter haunted them, echoing in their memories with uncomfortable clarity. But beneath the shame, something deeper stirred admiration, curiosity, and a growing desire to understand who Commander Reed truly was. Inside the base, Commander Reed continued walking beside the general. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Reed remarked quietly. Hawthorne chuckled dryly. "It's not every day we receive a Level 3 legacy alert. Those protocols were written before half my officers were even born. That's why I still use them," Reed replied. "It reminds people that the past doesn't disappear just because the world moves forward." They reached the entrance of the main operations building. Soldiers held the door open, their eyes widening slightly as Reed passed. Even they recognized him, if not by face, then by the symbolic weight his presence carried. Inside, screens flickered with data and satellite feeds. Officers moved quickly, but when Reed entered, a hush fell over the room. They had been briefed on a high-security arrival, but few expected this. As Reed studied the displays, his expression sharpened. The room watched him, the air thick with anticipation. The old man who had been mocked at the gate only moments ago now stood at the center of the nation's most crucial intelligence hub, stepping back into a role only he could fill. And with the ease of a master returning to his craft, he began analyzing classified information as if age had never touched him at all. The operations room was a whirl of quiet activity, monitors flickering with streams of numbers, satellite feeds, and blinking warning signals. Soldiers moved efficiently, glancing at Commander Reed with a mixture of awe and barely concealed curiosity. Every motion he made was precise, deliberate, and carried an authority that no rank could imitate. He was calm, almost serene, but there was a tension in his eyes, a focus sharpened by decades of experience few alive could match. "This isn't an attack," Reed said, his voice steady but low enough that only those nearest could hear. He leaned over a console examining encrypted codes that scrolled faster than anyone could read. It's a signal, one we set up decades ago, an old system of warnings. Someone out there remembers the protocols, someone who trusts that we are still listening. The room went quiet. Even General Hawthorne, standing rigid beside him, seemed momentarily at a loss. This was the kind of event that only came once in a lifetime, a hidden thread from the past suddenly surfacing to remind the world that some knowledge and actions never truly fade. "What does it mean?" an officer asked, stepping closer. His voice trembled slightly, betraying the nerves beneath his professional composure. Reed didn't look up. "It means we may have a chance to prevent a serious national threat, but only because we prepared for it years ago." The young guards at the gate. They saw a frail man, a worn ID, and assumed history was irrelevant. Yet history is alive. It speaks to those who listen. Miller and Jackson, still stationed near the entrance, watched through the glass panels separating the operations room from the hall. Their faces were pale, eyes wide with disbelief. They had followed orders in their limited understanding, and yet they had unknowingly confronted someone whose decisions once shaped the security of the entire country. They had mocked him, laughed at his ID, and almost delayed a chain of events that could have had severe consequences. Jackson's voice was barely a whisper. We almost screwed everything up." Miller nodded, too stunned to speak. The gravity of the situation pressed down on them, heavier than the weight of the cold morning at the gate. And yet, there was something about the calmness of Commander Reed that didn't inspire fear, it inspired understanding. Reed continued to study the signal. Fingers moving swiftly over the holographic keyboard, he deciphered layers of code with practiced ease. In mere minutes, he had mapped a pattern, traced its origin, and identified the potential target points. Officers leaned in, silently absorbing the process, impressed beyond measure. This man. Jackson muttered to Miller, "He's doing all of this. With that old cane, that fragile look. He's amazing." Miller swallowed, and we mocked him. The shame hit him fully now, an ache that would linger far longer than any physical punishment. General Hawthorne, who had been observing silently, finally spoke. "Commander Reed, the signal is from an unknown source, correct?" "Yes," Reed replied without hesitation. "But it follows a protocol we put in place for precisely this type of situation. Someone trusted that our safeguards would still be operational, that our legacy would protect the nation even in my absence. That's why I came personally." He glanced at the young guards through the observation glass. "Their guilt was obvious. They did not know," he said quietly. "It is the way of youth to see only what is in front of them. But today they have seen the power of patience and preparation. And perhaps in that brief moment they understand the difference between mockery and respect." Miller and Jackson looked down, unable to meet the man's eyes even from afar. Yet somehow in that silence, they felt the kindness in his words, a lesson far more impactful than any reprimand or lecture could have been. Reed returned his attention to the monitors. "The situation is under control," he said finally, his voice steady, reassuring. But it was a reminder that vigilance is not just about technology. It is about human judgment, about understanding that appearances can deceive and respect must be given even when recognition is not demanded. For the officers and soldiers in the room, the lesson was clear. For the two young privates at the gate, it was personal and transformative. They had learned in a few short minutes what many could spend a lifetime understanding, that true strength and service are not always visible, and that kindness and patience can coexist with power and authority. As the emergency subsided, Commander Reed prepared to leave. He nodded politely to General Hawthorne, who had remained by his side throughout the process. "I will walk," Reed said simply. "It keeps the mind and body alert, and the world needs alert minds." He stepped toward the exit, his cane tapping lightly on the floor. Miller and Jackson moved instinctively to salute, though the gesture felt inadequate for what they had witnessed. Reed paused for a moment at the doorway. His eyes found the two young men, and he smiled, not mockingly, not sternly, but warmly, with an understanding of their mistake and the lessons they were carrying with them. "Respect," he said quietly, as if teaching them one final truth, "does not come from rank or appearance. It comes from how you treat someone when you believe they are nothing. Never forget that." The words hung in the air long after he left. Miller and Jackson remained at attention, faces pale but thoughtful. The cold wind of the morning at the gate seemed less biting now, almost insignificant compared to the weight of what they had just learned. As Commander Reed walked away, the base returned to its normal rhythm, but nothing felt ordinary. A quiet sense of humility, awe, and gratitude settled over the young guards. They had witnessed a man whose kindness and expertise had quietly saved countless lives and prevented disaster, and they had learned that true heroes often arrive unnoticed, carrying the weight of history and the power of patience. In that moment, they understood that respect, vigilance, and humanity were intertwined in ways they had never fully appreciated before. And though the lesson had come through a moment of embarrassment and near disaster, it had left an indelible mark on their hearts, one that would guide them for the rest of their lives. The old man disappeared down the path beyond the gate, leaving a lingering impression that the quietest acts, the patient minds, and the kindest hearts can shape outcomes far greater than force, rank, or immediate recognition ever could.